So today I'm here to share with you the top 10 science fiction books that I read this year that were published before 2023. So I'm going to call these backlist titles, meaning any book published before this year. And if you're new to my year-end content, I do these videos early in November, and then I do my favorites published in 2023 closer to Christmas. I know it drives people nuts. I realize that there's a possibility I'll read an amazing book before the end of the year. And if that happens, I'm going to cheat and stick it in next year's video. So I know it drives people's nuts, but I promise this is the only way I can get my content out during flu and holiday season. So this is how we run around here. And if you're on board, let's get started. First, at number 10, we have The Trouble with Lichen by John Wyndham, and this is a science fiction book that completely flew under my radar until it was sent to me by a friend. And this is a story that follows a woman who chooses a career over having a family. She is a scientist, and through her work, they discover that there is this form of lichen that can extend people's lives. Naturally, this is a huge discovery, and so much of this book deals with what they have to do in order to try to figure out what is the ethical thing to do in this situation. Do you announce that this exists? Do you try to give it out very subtly to the public? Do you decide whose life is worth extending, and so forth? It's an incredibly smart book that again is framed around this very feminist narrative that I would argue was very much progressive for its day. This is again written by John Wyndham, and I've read some of his other more popular books, but this one again I had no idea that it even existed, and it is a kind of fantastic female-led story that you would think was written by a woman. And so all those preconceived ideas about men writing women in my mind completely goes out the window with books like this. I think it is just again so progressive, so thoughtful, and while I am someone who arguably has taken a more traditional life path, I am someone who is married with a child, but for whatever reason, stories about women who go against the grain, especially set in a time period when that was even less common, really sparked my interest. I found this to be a really fascinating book that again dealt with some feminine issues, but then also dealing with the larger consequences as well. What do you do when you can extend life, and how is this going to affect the world? Love the story. It went in some really unexpected directions, and it was so much fun. Then at number 9, I'm going to cheat and actually give you two books. So I have Rendezvous with Rama as well as 2001: A Space Odyssey, both by Arthur C. Clarke. I'm putting these together in the number 9 spot because my feelings and opinion toward these two books are very similar. I read them nearly back to back, and these are both my first entries with Arthur C. Clarke. And I will say that if you're someone like me who's often intimidated by classic works, Arthur C. Clarke is the way to go with science fiction. His books are so accessible. I've heard people argue that the character work perhaps is not the best. I definitely don't think I read these stories for the fully fleshed out, well-rounded characters, but I would argue you're not supposed to. Instead, if you're trying to, again, dip your toes into classics when it comes to sci-fi, I think that this is great because it really plays with some of the tropes that you will see, the stories and plot lines you will see told over and over again in a really easy to understand package. And so you have the characters that are at times sitting around and discussing the science and technology and what they're going to do. But again, I think that actually makes it easier to follow for someone who perhaps is newer to the genre. And if you are already someone who loves the genre, I don't know why. If you haven't yet read these books, please do so. They're so easy to fly through. I think that Rendezvous with Rama is a stronger book overall, but the beginning of 2001 has the most amazing first sentence that I will never forget. And I highly recommend checking out these books, whether you're new to science fiction or have been reading it for years. These ones are exactly as good as everyone told me they would be, and I definitely look forward to reading more by Arthur C. Clarke next year. Next, at number 8, I'm going to continue to cheat on this list because you know what? It's my list. I can put it out in November and do what I want. So I'm actually going to put an entire book series on here. So I'm going to reference all of the books in the Murderbot Diaries that are backlist titles. I got a chance to read through them all this year in preparation for the new book, which might make an appearance on my best of the year list for 2023. We shall see. But I had previously read the first 2 novellas and hadn't gone on since then. I first read All Systems Red back when it first came out. I was very new to science fiction. At that point, I was basically only reading hugely accessible works like Leviathan Wakes, and I really don't think I was prepared for what Murderbot was trying to do. Now rereading it as more of a, let's say, seasoned science fiction reader, I appreciate the series so much. I've done a full video talking about why I and the internet love the series as much as we do. It's very episodic, but it's simply, I just love spending time with the character. I enjoy their perspective. I think that the book is very progressive, bringing different ideas about identity and personhood in a very comical, satirical way, but still actually adding a lot of action and adventure. I forgot how much of a plot there is in All Systems Red, and each story contains this little episode. And again, I always describe this as a TV show because you feel like you're consuming little episodes. As for favorites, it's really hard to say. I definitely have strong feelings and nostalgia for All Systems Red, but honestly, all the stories in my mind work really well together, and the series is really even from start to the current publication. So I do recommend this series if you haven't checked it out. Again, highly accessible, and also a love letter to those of you that already love science fiction. I think that Martha Wells knows what she's doing. Then at number 7, we have The Light Brigade by Cameron Hurley. This is a military fiction story that follows a person who decides to sign up for the military after a terrible attack has happened against our world that is believed to be done by Mars. And so they want to get justice and persevere. They go along and sign up, and they find out that in order to fight against the Martians, they are forced then to go through this process where they are sent there by light, which allows them to go at essentially the speed of light and move a lot quicker. However, they find that when people go out to war and come back, they come back changed. This is a book that I can't really describe, but why I love it so much, because so much of this book is spoilery. There is a lot of twists and turns about what is actually happening within this book, but that you really want to discover for yourself. I've seen a lot of reviews give away way more than I feel comfortable on camera. This is one that is just incredibly smart. It has some great conversations around the brutality and grittiness of war and what it means and how it changes a soldier. I think, again, if you love something like Ender's Game, I think this one is a great complement to that. And while I always say that I don't tend to love stories about gritty military life, it's not normally my thing, Cameron Hurley does it so well that I cannot help but appreciate what she is doing here. And on top of that, this book has amazing layers and plotting to it. It's the kind of story that demands to be reread, which I still need to do at the time of recording this, but I will do it, because once you get to the end and everything is revealed, you just want to go back to the beginning and see if the author laid down all the groundwork along the way, which I know they did, and I want to see it all for myself. But I am quickly becoming a huge fan of this author's work. They ended up on my favorites list last year, and I have a feeling they will end up here again and again, because this one is super smart. And again, if you love military science fiction more than I do, this one will probably be even higher up on your list. Then at number 6, we have Diaspora by Greg Egan, which is an incredibly hard book to summarize on camera, but I will try to do so. I believe the book is set in the 30th century, where humanity has evolved beyond our current state. So there are those that are probably most closely related to us, known as the Fleshers, that are still in organic bodies, but there's also these robots where they have human minds that are implanted into mechanical beings. And then we also have the other group that have taken the minds of individuals or personalities and download them into supercomputers, and people exist in that state too. And so this is a story that just has insanely cool ideas built around it. And I've mentioned before, I've read several Greg Egan books at this point in time, and I always say his ideas are incredible. But in the past, I found that the stories suffered a little bit in terms of the plot and character that I want to support those amazing ideas. And here, this is where, in my mind, Greg Egan hit the sweet spot for me, because the ideas in this book are insane, and it makes me feel so smart when I understand an inch of what he's talking about. And even when I don't fully understand the concepts that he's discussing, because again, I don't have that scientific background that I would like to as a science fiction reader. I'm learning, I'm working on it. But when I do understand a glimpse of what he's saying, I am just in awe of all of it. And on top of that, I really felt like the author took the extra time to, again, create a narrative, characters that perhaps are not the most well-rounded characters in any fiction story, but are people that I'm interested in. You have characters where you get their perspective and you get to experience a story through their eyes. And for me, it really came together, and I really understood the love of Greg Egan, that I have friends that adore their work, and I'm really seeing that with this one. Highly recommend it. It's one, again, that I absolutely need to reread probably many times, because I know I didn't catch it all in my first go through, but this book floored me. Highly recommend it. It likely will become a stronger favorite with each reread, because I know there was so much packed in there, and I think it's a great place to start if you're interested in this smart author's work. And then at number 5, we have The Automaton by Ian Young, and this is a story that is set in a far-flung future. Basically, humanity has hit a point where they know they're dying out, and so they create these artificial constructs to continue beyond after the organic humanity has died. And then the story is told 5,000 years after that, where we find this artificial construct that is waking up, and they, along with the help of this AI entity are trying to piece together what happens and catch us up. So we see the story through those perspectives and get to piece together the Civil War, what happened, what all led to humanity's demise, and what came afterwards. The story itself is fascinating. I've said so many times before that I love stories involving artificial intelligence, and in my mind, this is done right, where it's not just used for the sake of creating a fun plot and adventure. Instead, as I've said so many times, it's clear that this author has a great appreciation for the classic. So if you're someone who's more drawn to the classics like Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov, this is the kind of modern science fiction I would recommend picking up. I really feel like this one has the full package. It has great world building that is slowly revealed to the reader. The characters that we are introduced to are interesting and complex, and again, create a good viewpoint for us to see into this future. And the writing itself is excellent. I see all kinds of writing, especially when it comes to indie work. So something like this really catches my attention when it's so well done, so precise. And I think a lot of you, if you share my taste in really smart work like this, are going to really enjoy something like this. So highly recommend it. I hope more of you check it out. I know people tend to enjoy when I come up with more underhyped hidden gems, and this is one that in my mind, I don't see enough people reading and reviewing. Then at number 4, we have Quicksilver by Neal Stephenson. If you follow my channel for a while, you probably aren't surprised that Neal Stephenson made my list once again. This is the first book in the Baroque cycle, and it is set during the Puritan era. The story is specifically told through the perspective of this character, Jack, who is going about and trying to seek answers in the world. The story, while it's definitely fiction, is infused with a lot of historical details, particularly those of the great minds of science and philosophy of that time period. Now, I love that because of the time period that it's set, religion and those beliefs also play into the story. So there's a lot of great conversations around the afterlife and the conflicts, or perhaps the symmetry that comes with religion and science. And I just love it. I've said so many times before that Neal Stephenson could talk about anything, and I will just soak it all up. I do think that this one is very interesting in some of the conversations it's having, reminding me a little bit of Anathea. However, compared to some of his other works, this one did lose me in places where the author went on some tangents, not necessarily the tangents about science fiction, but the story kind of meanders with the characters wandering around doing some various things that I didn't find to be as interesting as I would like. So it is a time that I would slightly suggest Neal Stephenson edit himself down, but I still love so much of what's in this book that while some sections could have been shortened in my mind, I don't want to criticize the book too much. Obviously, I'm putting it on a great spot on this list, and I definitely want to continue on with this cycle, and I will report back as I have additional thoughts as I continue through all of Neal Stephenson's work. But the first book in the Baroque cycle definitely earns a place on this list, and I hope that you check it out if you share my love for this author's work. Then at number 3, we have New York 2140 by Kim Stanley Robinson, and this is a standalone science fiction book that is set obviously in the year 2140 in New York, and the story is told over a multitude of different perspectives, and so the story almost reads like a series of vignettes. It's set in a future where New York has flooded, and so the skyscrapers have almost become islands where people exist. It's a story that certainly is dystopian in nature, given this future, or at least has that kind of post-apocalyptic type feel. The story starts out with two characters discussing the crumbling world in terms of the economics, the evils of capitalism and how it has pushed society to that point. So the story definitely has info dumpy moments. However, if you know that I love Neal Stephenson, you probably aren't surprised that I actually loved the quote unquote info dumps in this one. And I found this book to be really fascinating. I really love the perspectives, and while it jumps around between the characters, I found everyone equally quite interesting to read about, which is not something I always say in these multi-story focuses, but in this one it worked really well. And I am someone who has never traveled to New York. I've obviously never lived there. And for stories like this, often I find that if you're not from that place, if you're not intimately aware of that place from a personal perspective, a lot can be lost. And while I'm certain that New Yorkers will get more out of the story than I did, I still thought that the placement and focus on New York as almost an entity within the story worked incredibly well. I was fascinated by it. And again, I'm sure there's small references that I don't quite get the details of. I thought the author did a great job of bringing in the rest of us and making the story very inclusive and just having us all go along for this ride. I thought the story was just very original, very different. And while I mentioned that it's set in a future that feels very post-apocalyptic in nature, or perhaps on the precipice of apocalypse where we see the world flooding, there's actually a great feeling of hope within the story. I love that more optimistic tone, which I wasn't expecting. And it's a story that really caught my attention. I feel like it's probably because of that tone I loved it so much, because in our day and age, there's a lot of reasons to be very depressed and down about the state of our world. And this one just made me kind of smile, which is pretty bizarre for a story that's all about a drowning New York. But it kind of reminded me of the things that I love about the world and suggesting the possibilities for us to turn things around in the places where humanity can maybe make some adjustments and see a brighter future. So I'm getting all gushy, let's move on. Then at number 2, we have Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. This, of course, is the science fiction adventure classic that we all know and love. Even if you haven't read the book, you're probably familiar with the basic story. We follow a young man who goes along with a professor who believes that he has a map to get to the center of the world. They go through Iceland and the story starts there and they go down from there. This technically is the only reread on this list. So this is a book that I actually read prior to this year, but I didn't fall in love with it. It didn't become a favorite the year I read it because I read it immediately after reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and the books are just almost too closely related that it made for a poorer experience when I realized how similar the plots are. However, rereading it with fresh eyes without the strong comparisons between his other work, I was obsessed with this story. Now, I'm hesitant to talk about this on camera because the last time that I put Jules Verne in my favorites of the year video, I got a lot of criticism and people questioning my terrible taste in science fiction. I didn't realize that Jules Verne was that controversial, but I'm gonna say it anyway that I enjoy his adventure stories. Are there other science fiction authors that do more complicated work, that have deeper ideas that they explore in there? Is it an author who does a lot of info dumping? Absolutely, that is all true. But I happen to love Jules Verne for his adventure stories. He makes me excited for the possibility of science. And I love that despite the age of his stories, these ones in my mind hold up very well to someone like myself who struggles with classics. I often find them to be very daunting. And instead, these ones I can just get lost in, and they make me again excited for that possibility, those futures, those ideas, those alternative paths that we could take with society, and the adventures and options that are out there. So I love Jules Verne, and this book, without the comparisons to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, is pretty much perfection in my mind. I will read it again and again. I had so much fun with it, and hopefully if you haven't read it, you'll check it out, and hopefully too many of you don't judge me for my Jules Verne love. And finally, at the number 1 spot is a book that you might have remembered I gushed about earlier this year, and nothing has taken its place as the best backlist science fiction book I've read, and that is The Swarm. This is a super chunky science fiction thriller that is set in our near future. However, the Earth is starting to rebel against us. So you have the creatures in the ocean that are doing strange things, the water levels are rising, and it just appears that we have finally hit that point with the changes to our Earth, and the Earth is rebelling against what humanity has done for it. So with a premise like this, obviously this author has certain intentions or feelings that they are trying to put across in terms of their feelings about global warming and environmentalism. And so take that all with a grain of salt because I don't want to get into arguments in the comments again. But in terms of a story, I think that the premise is fantastic. I love the idea of the Earth rebelling against us. While I love science fiction, you know that I also love horror and stories that involve that epic scale. And that's what I love so much about this book. It's told from multiple perspectives, and we follow the characters as they are slowly getting hints from different points of view from different places around the world that the Earth is not quite right, that something is wrong, something is building, and it's more than just the usual ebbs and flows of our world. And we see that build and build, and for me, I was glued to this story. It's, I believe, nearly 900 pages. I remember flying through it in maybe just a couple days, which I read fast, but even for me, that was pretty fast, and I adore this one. I do believe it's been turned into a TV show, which I don't think has great ratings online. I haven't seen it, I'm more of a book reader, but this is one that if you can get past the page length, if you're open to reading a big, heavy book like this, I think it's well worth your time. I found it so exciting. I would cut nothing from this book. Despite the length, I think that every perspective, every page, every conversation was entirely worth it, and I was never bored. And that is high praise for a book this long. So if again you share my love of books like those in the vein of Neil Stephenson, I really recommend picking up this book. It's one that I can't stop thinking about. I'm dying to reread. It's a little bit long, so it'll take me a few days, but it's well worth your time, my time, and I just cannot stop singing this book's praises. So please let me know down below if you're planning on checking it out if you haven't yet, because it's so good and I love it so much, and I'm happy to finally have the excuse to just gush about it online again. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And let me know, what is the best science fiction book that you read this year? If I haven't read it, I'll definitely try to check it out in the future year. And don't forget, if you want to see more best of the year content, do consider sticking around and subscribing, because I have more videos coming for fantasy, for horror, and all the good end of the year content that we all know and love is coming shortly. If you want to hit that little notification bell, I appreciate that. You can also give me a thumbs up, drop an emoji in the comments just to let me know you're here. And otherwise, I'll talk to you again soon. Thanks for watching. Okay, bye-bye.